Listen carefully. World Bank and IMF that's bled Africa dry for 65 years. 7 minutes ago, I launched the Afro, Africa's independent currency backed by 524 tons of gold, and you're panicking because this just ended your debt colonization system forever. You believed we'd beg for your dollar loans while you printed trillions devaluing our reserves. You assumed CFA franc chains locked us permanently. You were catastrophically wrong. I built this with 54 nations and Chinese blockchain your central banks can't control. You're finished forever. Let me tell you exactly what happened. On December 15th, 2025, I stood in Accra, Ghana, at the headquarters of the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat, surrounded by heads of state from 54 African nations, and I pressed a button that launched the Afro, Africa's first independent pan-continental digital currency. That single action terminated 70 years of Western monetary control over 1.4 billion Africans. The Afro went live simultaneously across 54 nations. Within 7 minutes, 340 million digital wallets were activated. Within 40 minutes, cross-border transactions worth $8.7 billion processed without a single dollar, euro, or CFA franc involved. Within 3 hours, the World Bank issued an emergency statement calling the Afro economically destabilizing and demanding immediate consultations. Within 6 hours, the IMF threatened to suspend lending programs to participating nations. Within 12 hours, the United States Treasury Department announced sanctions reviews. Within 24 hours, the French government had an emergency cabinet meeting to discuss the collapse of the CFA franc zone. Within 48 hours, the European Central Bank warned of systemic risks to global financial stability. But here's what matters. None of their threats worked, none of their warnings stopped us, and none of their predictions of economic collapse materialized because we built the Afro on infrastructure they can't touch, with partnerships they can't break, and with technology they can't control. Listen carefully to how we reached this moment, because the day I took power in Burkina Faso and immediately ordered a comprehensive audit of every international financial agreement binding our nation. That audit, completed on February 18th, revealed a financial extraction system so sophisticated and so brutal that I knew instantly we were dealing not with legitimate debt, but with organized theft. The audit showed Burkina Faso owed $3.8 billion to the World Bank, IMF, and various Western creditors. But when my economic team traced every single loan, every interest payment, every restructuring fee, and every conditionality penalty from 1960 to SEER, we discovered Burkina Faso had already repaid $11.4 billion on those original loans. We paid back 3 times what we borrowed, yet our debt kept growing. How? Because World Bank loan agreements included compound interest rates averaging 6.8% annually, IMF structural adjustment programs required us to devalue our currency by 40% in 1994, which instantly doubled our debt in real terms, and every debt restructuring added penalty fees averaging 12% of the outstanding principal. The audit documented 63 years of deliberate financial entrapment. Page 147 showed World Bank loans for infrastructure development required us to hire French construction companies at prices 340% above market rates. Page 284 showed IMF loan conditions forced us to privatize our water system, which was then purchased by French company Veolia at 1/5 its actual value. Page 412 showed debt service payments consumed 47% of our national budget in 2022, meaning nearly half of every tax dollar collected from Burkinabe citizens went directly to Western banks instead of schools, hospitals, or infrastructure. I read that 890-page audit 3 times. Then I called President Assimi Goïta of Mali and General Abdourahmane Chiani of Niger, because I knew if this was happening to Burkina Faso, it was happening to them too. On March 8th, our 3 finance ministers met in Niamey and compared audits. Mali's debt audit revealed identical patterns: $4.2 billion owed, but $13.8 billion already repaid since 1960, with debt still growing due to compound interest and penalty fees. Niger's audit showed $2.9 billion owed, but $9.1 billion are already repaid, with 52% of their national budget going to debt service. We were looking at systematic theft across the entire Sahel region. But then our finance ministers expanded the analysis to all 14 CFA franc zone countries: Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, Benin, Togo, Guinea-Bissau, Cameroon, Chad, Central African Republic, Republic of Congo, Gabon, and Equatorial Guinea. The combined audit, completed on May 30th, revealed these 14 nations collectively owed $184 billion to Western creditors, but had already repaid $640 billion since 1960. We repaid 3.5 times what we borrowed, yet our combined debt kept growing. The audit identified the mechanism. The CFA franc itself was a debt trap. Listen carefully to how the CFA franc works, because this is the financial weapon France has used to control 14 African nations for 65 years. The CFA franc is not a real currency, it's a colonial control mechanism disguised as money. Here's the system. 14 African nations use either the West African CFA franc or the Central African CFA franc, both of which are printed not in Africa but in Chamalières, France, at the Banque de France printing facility. Every single CFA franc banknote in circulation in 14 African countries is manufactured on French soil, but the theft goes deeper. The CFA franc is pegged to the euro at a fixed rate, 655.957 CFA francs equal 1 euro, and this peg is guaranteed by the French Treasury. To maintain this guarantee, France requires all 14 CFA franc nations to deposit 50% of their foreign exchange reserves in a French Treasury account called the operations account. As of December 31, 2024, 14 African nations held $68 billion in foreign reserves in this French Treasury account. That's $68 billion of African wealth sitting in Paris, earning 0.75% annual interest for African nations, while France invests that same money in European bonds earning 4.2% annually. France pockets the 3.45% difference, $2.3 billion per year, in pure profit extracted from African reserves. But it gets worse. Because the CFA franc is pegged to the euro, when the euro strengthens against other currencies, African exports become more expensive and less competitive globally. From 2015 to 2024, the euro appreciated 28% against the Chinese yuan, which made CFA franc zone exports to China, Africa's largest trading partner, 28% more expensive. African farmers couldn't compete. African manufacturers couldn't export. African economies stagnated. Meanwhile, French imports into CFA franc countries became artificially cheap, which destroyed local industries. Côte d'Ivoire's textile industry collapsed because French clothing became cheaper than locally produced fabric. Senegal's agricultural processing sector collapsed because French processed foods undercut local production. The CFA franc wasn't a currency, it was an economic extermination tool. Our finance ministers calculated the total extraction. From 1960 to 2024, the CFA franc system cost 14 African nations $832 billion in lost monetary sovereignty, comprising $147 billion in foreign reserves locked in French treasury accounts earning below market interest, $284 billion in lost export competitiveness due to euro overvaluation, $241 billion in destroyed local industries unable to compete with artificially cheap French imports, and $160 billion in seigniorage, the profit France earned from printing African money. France extracted $832 billion over 65 years, averaging $13 billion annually from 14 nations with a combined GDP of $580 billion. France was extracting 2.2% of 14 African economies every single year through pure monetary manipulation. When I saw those numbers, I knew exactly what we had to do. We had to kill the CFA franc and replace it with a currency France couldn't control. On June 15th, I convened a secret meeting in Ouagadougou. Present were President Assimi Goïta of Mali, General Abdourahmane Tchiani of Niger, President Macky Sall of Senegal, President Alassane Ouattara of Côte d'Ivoire, President Patrice Talon of Benin, President Faure Gnassingbé of Togo, President Julius Maada Bio of Sierra Leone, President George Weah of Liberia, President Nana Akufo-Addo of Ghana, President Bola Tinubu of Nigeria, President Paul Kagame of Rwanda, President Felix Tshisekedi of the Democratic Republic of Congo, President Juan Lourenço of Angola, President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, President Hakainde Hichilema of Zambia, President William Ruto of Kenya, President Yoweri Museveni of Uganda, President Samia Suluhu Hassan of Tanzania, President Mohamed Bazoum of Niger before the coup, President Macky Sall before Senegal's transition, and representatives from 34 additional African nations. I told them, we're launching a pan-African digital currency backed by African gold reserves, built on Chinese blockchain infrastructure, and completely independent of Western financial systems. The room went silent. Then President Kagame of Rwanda spoke. When do we start? That's when I knew we'd win. We called it the Afro. The name was deliberate, short, strong, proud, impossible to mispronounce in any African language, and a direct challenge to the dollar, euro, and pound. We designed the Afro as a digital-first currency using blockchain technology, which meant no Western central bank could control it. No French treasury could hold our reserves hostage, and no IMF could impose conditions on how we managed our money. But we needed three things to make the Afro work: technology infrastructure, gold reserves to back the currency, and a payment system to process transactions. We got all three from partners the West couldn't threaten. On August 3rd, I flew to Beijing and met with President Xi Jinping at the Great Hall of the People. I brought our finance ministers and central bank governors from 20 African nations. I showed President Xi our CFA franc audit and the $832 billion extraction calculation. I told him, we're building a pan-African currency to replace the CFA franc and challenge dollar dominance, and we need China's help with blockchain infrastructure and payment systems. President Xi asked one question: when France threatens you, will you back down? I answered, France already threatened us. We expelled their troops anyway. We'll expel their currency too. President Xi smiled and said, then China will help you build the Afro. On August 10th, we signed the Afro-Currency Development Agreement with China. The agreement had four components. First, China's Digital Currency Research Institute would provide blockchain infrastructure for the Afro, specifically a fork of China's digital yuan technology adapted for pan-African use, capable of processing 300,000 transactions per second with quantum-resistant encryption and offline payment capability using near-field communication chips. Second, Huawei would build the physical infrastructure, 340,000 payment terminals across 54 African nations, 5G network upgrades to ensure transaction speed, and data centers in Accra, Nairobi, Lagos, Kinshasa, and Johannesburg to ensure no single point of failure. Third, UnionPay would integrate the Afro into its global payment network, which meant 180 countries and 2.4 billion cardholders could transact in Afros starting day one. Fourth, China Development Bank would provide a $12 billion infrastructure loan at 1.8% interest over 15 years to fund the build-out, a fraction of what Western banks would charge and without a single political condition attached. We signed the agreement on August 10th. Construction began August 24th. We completed the entire Pan-African infrastructure in 16 months. But technology alone wasn't enough. We needed reserves to back the Afro and give it credibility. This is where the West's greatest mistake came back to destroy them. For 65 years, the IMF and World Bank told African nations to abandon gold-backed currencies and adopt fiat money managed by Western-educated central bankers following Western monetary policy models. African nations complied, and the result was inflation, currency devaluation, and permanent dependence on dollar and euro reserves. But a few African leaders never forgot the lesson of Muammar Gaddafi. In 2009, Gaddafi proposed the gold dinar, a pan-African currency backed by Libya's 144 tons of gold reserves, to replace the CFA franc and challenge dollar dominance in African oil markets. Western leaders panicked. French President Nicolas Sarkozy called the gold dinar a threat to the financial security of mankind. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's emails, released by WikiLeaks in 2016, explicitly stated Gaddafi's gold dinar plan was one of the reasons for NATO's 2011 intervention in Libya. The West murdered Gaddafi and destroyed Libya to prevent African monetary sovereignty. But Gaddafi's idea never died. It waited for leaders brave enough to finish what he started. On September 12th, I nationalized Burkina Faso's gold mining sector. We terminated contracts with Canadian, British, and Australian mining companies that had been extracting Burkina Faso's gold at royalty rates of 3%, meaning for every $100 million in gold they extracted, Burkina Faso received $3 million, while they kept $97 million. We replaced them with state-owned Burkina Mining Corporation and Russian mining partners willing to accept 50-50 profit sharing. By December 2024, Burkina Faso's gold reserves increased from 0.4 tons to 28 tons. Mali followed. They nationalized Barrick Gold's Lulo Gunkoto mining complex in October and increased national reserves from 1.2 tons to 47 tons by December 2024. Niger nationalized Chinese-operated Samira Hill gold mine under new terms, giving Niger 60% of output. Reserves increased from 0 tons to 15 tons by December 2024. Ghana renegotiated contracts with AngloGold Ashanti and Newmont Corporation, increasing royalty rates from 5% to 18%. Reserves increased from 8.7 tons to 34 tons by December 2024. Nigeria, which produces 12 tons of gold annually but had 0 official reserves because illegal mining sent everything overseas, deployed military units to seize control of mining sites in Zamfara and Kebbi states. Official reserves increased from 0 tons to 21 tons by December 2024. South Africa, sitting on 125 tons of official reserves, committed 40 tons to the Afro Reserve Fund. The Democratic Republic of Congo, with 7 tons official reserves but producing 25 tons annually, committed 18 tons. Tanzania committed 11 tons. Zimbabwe committed 8 tons. By December 31st, 2024, 26 African nations collectively committed 412 tons of gold to back the Afro, worth $28 billion at $68,000 per kilogram. We didn't just back the Afro with gold, we backed it with more gold than the United Kingdom holds in reserves, 310 tons, more than India holds, 795 tons, and approaching what China officially declares, 2,264 tons. Western financial analysts called our gold reserves insufficient and predicted the Afro would collapse within weeks. They were lying. The dollar isn't backed by gold. It's backed by nothing except the U.S. military's ability to bomb countries that stop using it. The euro isn't backed by gold. It's backed by nothing except the European Central Bank's printing press. The CFA franc isn't backed by gold. It's backed by France's colonial military presence. Yet Western analysts demanded the Afro hold more gold backing than any Western currency simply because we're African. We ignored them. On December 2nd, 2025, we launched the Afro testing phase across 5 pilot countries: Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Ghana, and Nigeria. We distributed 50 million digital wallets via mobile apps compatible with any smartphone. We installed 40,000 payment terminals in major cities. We partnered with mobile money platforms M-Pesa, Orange Money, and MTN Mobile Money to enable Afro transactions through existing infrastructure. We set the initial exchange rate at 1 Afro equals 1.20 USD, deliberately pricing the Afro above the dollar to signal strength. Western economists predicted immediate failure. They said Africans wouldn't trust a new currency, merchants wouldn't accept it, and the exchange rate would collapse within days. The opposite happened. On December 2nd, 2025, at 6 a.m., we activated the first 10 million wallets in Ouagadougou, Bamako, Niamey, Accra, and Lagos. By 9 a.m., 2.4 million transactions worth $180 million had processed. By 6 p.m., 8.7 million transactions worth $920 million had cleared. By December 3rd, 2025, at midnight, 14.3 million transactions worth $1.8 billion had successfully completed without a single system failure. Merchants accepted Afros because transaction fees were 0.5%, compared to 2.8% for Visa, 3.1% for MasterCard, and 4.2% for mobile money transfers. Consumers adopted Afros because cross-border remittances cost 0 fees. A Burkinabe worker in Ghana could send 100 Afros to family in Ouagadougou, and 100 Afros arrived instantly, compared to Western Union charging $12 per $100 transfer and taking 3 days. By December 15, 2025, the pilot program had processed $14.7 billion in transactions across 50 million wallets, with 99.97% uptime. The Afro worked. That's when I called the Continental launch. On December 15, 2025, at 9 a.m. GMT, 54 African heads of state gathered in Accra, and we activated the Afro across the entire continent simultaneously. The system went live in 54 nations covering 1.4 billion people at the exact same moment. Within 7 minutes, 340 million digital wallets activated, more than the entire population of the United States. Within 40 minutes, cross-border transactions worth $8.7 billion processed, more than the entire daily GDP of Kenya. Within 3 hours, merchants in 54 countries accepted Afros for everything from street food to car purchases. Within 12 hours, the Afro became the 3rd most traded digital currency in the world by transaction volume, behind only China's digital yuan and stablecoins pegged to the US dollar. We didn't ask the World Bank for permission. We didn't consult the IMF. We didn't seek approval from the US Treasury. We just did it. The Western response was immediate panic on December 15, 2025, 3 hours and 17 minutes after the Afro launch. The World Bank issued an emergency statement calling the Afro a destabilizing monetary experiment that threatens regional economic integration and violates international financial standards. The statement demanded African nations engage in immediate consultations with international financial institutions before proceeding further. I read that statement live on television and responded with one sentence: "We consulted you for 65 years and got poorer. We'll proceed without you now." At 4:32 p.m. GMT, the IMF released a statement warning that countries adopting the Afro may face suspension of lending programs and technical assistance until compliance with IMF monetary framework standards is restored. I responded, You suspended lending to Burkina Faso when we expelled French troops. We grew 6.8% anyway. Suspend us again. We don't need your debt. At 6:45 p.m. GMT, United States Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen announced the Treasury Department would review sanctions and financial access for countries undermining global monetary stability through unilateral currency initiatives. I responded, you sanctioned Russia and they're selling more oil than ever. You sanctioned Iran and they're building nuclear infrastructure. You sanctioned Venezuela and they're exporting to China. Sanction Africa. We'll trade with the 87% of the world that isn't you. But the most desperate response came from France. On December 16, 2025, French President Emmanuel Macron held an emergency cabinet meeting to address the CFA franc crisis. Meeting minutes, leaked to African media on December 2025, revealed Macron demanded immediate action to preserve French monetary sovereignty in Africa because 8 of the 14 CFA franc zone nations, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, Benin, Togo, and Guinea-Bissau, had officially adopted the Afro and announced phased withdrawal from the CFA franc system over 180 days. Macron's finance minister warned that if the CFA franc collapsed, France would lose access to $68 billion in African foreign reserves held in French treasury accounts, which France was actively using as collateral for European bond issuances. Losing that collateral would increase France's borrowing costs by an estimated 0.7%, adding $8.4 billion annually to France's debt service payments. Macron ordered French diplomats to offer African leaders enhanced partnership agreements worth $15 billion in development aid if they abandoned the Afro and recommitted to the CFA franc. Every single African leader refused. Listen carefully to why France's offers failed, because this reveals the fundamental shift in African consciousness that the West still doesn't understand. President Bassirou Diomaye Faye of Senegal, who took office in April 2024 on an anti-French sovereignty platform, publicly rejected France's offer in December 2025 with this statement: France offers us $2 billion to stay in the CFA franc, but the CFA franc costs Senegal $3.4 billion annually in lost monetary sovereignty. Why would we pay $3.4 billion to receive $2 billion? That's not partnership, that's stupidity. President Alassane Ouattara of Côte d'Ivoire, historically one of France's closest allies in West Africa, rejected France's offer on December 2025, stating, "For 65 years, France told us the CFA franc guaranteed stability, but Côte d'Ivoire's economy grew faster in the 6 months after adopting the Afro than in the previous 6 years under the CFA franc. Stability that keeps us poor is not stability, it's a cage." Even President Faure Gnassingbé of Togo, whose family had governed Togo since 1967 with continuous French support, rejected France's offer on December 2025. "My father's generation believed we needed France to survive. My generation knows we need France to leave so we can thrive. The Afro proved we can manage our own money. We're keeping it." France lost the CFA franc zone in 8 days. On December 2025, the West African Economic and Monetary Union, the regional institution governing the West African CFA franc for 8 member states, held an emergency meeting in Dakar. By a vote of 7-1, members voted to dissolve the CFA franc monetary union and transition to the Afro as the official regional currency by July 31, 2025. Only one nation voted against, Guinea-Bissau, whose president Umaro Sissoko Embalo feared political instability, but even Guinea-Bissau adopted the Afro on February 15, 2025, after popular protests demanded monetary sovereignty. On February 4, 2025, the Central African Economic and Monetary Community, governing the Central African CFA franc for 6 member states, voted 4-2 to transition to the Afro by August 31, 2025. Cameroon and Gabon initially opposed, citing concerns about inflation and capital flight, but both reversed their positions on February 20, 2025, after economic data showed Afro-zone countries experiencing 8.2% GDP growth in December 2025 compared to 1.4% growth for CFA franc holdouts. By March 1, 2025, all 14 former CFA franc nations had officially adopted the Afro. The CFA franc, France's primary tool of African monetary control for 65 years, ceased to exist. The economic impact on France was immediate and catastrophic. On March 5, 2025, the French Treasury announced it would return $68 billion in African foreign reserves previously held in operations accounts, as required under CFA franc dissolution agreements. But France didn't have $68 billion in liquid reserves. That money had been invested in European bonds, infrastructure projects, and used as collateral for French sovereign debt. To return the reserves, France had to liquidate bond positions at a loss, which cost French taxpayers $4.2 billion and increased borrowing from European capital markets, which raised France's debt to GDP ratio from 112% to 118% in 1 month. On March 12, 2025, Moody's downgraded France's credit rating from AA2 to AA3, citing unexpected fiscal pressures from African monetary disengagement and rising debt service costs. On March 18, 2025, French banks Société Générale and BNP Paribas announced combined losses of $3.8 billion in their African operations due to the CFA franc collapse, as both banks held significant CFA franc-denominated assets that became worthless overnight. On March 24, 2025, the Banque de France printing facility in Chamalières announced it would lay off 340 workers because demand for CFA franc printing had dropped to zero. For 65 years, France printed African money and charged African nations for the service. That revenue stream disappeared in 90 days. But France's losses were nothing compared to the panic spreading through the World Bank and IMF. The Afro didn't just replace the CFA franc, it threatened the entire Western debt model in Africa. Here's why. Under the old system, African nations borrowed dollars from the World Bank or IMF, which required them to earn dollars through exports to repay loans, which meant their economic policies prioritized Western markets over domestic development, which locked them into permanent underdevelopment and dependency. The Afro broke that cycle. With the Afro, African nations could trade with each other using Afros, which meant they no longer needed to earn dollars for intra-African trade, which meant 54 African nations representing $3.1 trillion in combined GDP could now function as an integrated economic bloc without touching Western currencies. The implications were existential for Western financial dominance. On April 8, 2025, Kenya and Tanzania signed a bilateral trade agreement denominated entirely in Afros, covering $4.2 billion in annual trade volume. Everything from Kenyan tea exports to Tanzanian agricultural imports now transacted in Afros with $0 involvement. On April 15, 2025, Nigeria and South Africa signed an Afro-denominated energy agreement where Nigeria exports liquefied natural gas to South Africa in exchange for Afro payments, $7.8 billion annually, with $0 clearing required. On April 22, 2025, the Democratic Republic of Congo and Zambia signed an Afro-denominated mining agreement for cobalt and copper exports worth $6.4 billion annually. Again, $0 involved. By May 1, 2025, intra-African trade conducted in Afros reached $127 billion, surpassing intra-African trade in dollars for the first time in history. By June 1, 2025, intra-African trade in Afros reached $284 billion, more than total African trade with the United States. The Afro was replacing the dollar as Africa's primary trade currency in real time. The World Bank and IMF couldn't tolerate this. On May 15, 2025, the World Bank announced it would suspend new lending to any country using the Afro for more than 50% of government transactions, claiming the Afro lacks adequate regulatory oversight and poses systemic risks to debt sustainability. The announcement targeted 12 African nations: Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Senegal, Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Democratic Republic of Congo, Zambia, and South Africa, whose governments had transitioned more than 60% of transactions to Afros by April 2025. The World Bank threat was clear: abandon the Afro or lose access to World Bank loans. Every single nation refused. President William Ruto of Kenya responded on May 16, 2025. The World Bank lent Kenya $48 billion over 40 years. Kenya has repaid $52 billion and still owes $31 billion due to interest and fees. That's not lending, that's theft with paperwork. Keep your loans. We'll use Afros and build with Chinese partners who charge 2% interest instead of your 7%. The IMF escalated. On May 22, 2025, the IMF announced it would suspend voting rights and technical assistance for member countries engaging in unregulated monetary arrangements outside the international financial architecture. The announcement specifically targeted the Afro and threatened 26 African nations with expulsion from IMF governance structures unless they returned to compliance with IMF monetary standards. The threat backfired spectacularly. On May 24, 2025, I convened an emergency meeting of the African Union in Addis Ababa, and we voted 51-3 to formally withdraw African participation from IMF decision-making processes until the IMF acknowledges African monetary sovereignty and ceases punitive actions against the Afro. Only 3 nations opposed: Botswana, Mauritius, and Seychelles, whose economies remain heavily dollarized and dependent on Western tourism. But even those 3 nations refused to condemn the Afro. They simply abstained from confrontation. The IMF's threat unified Africa instead of dividing it. Then came the sanctions. On June 5, 2025, the United States Treasury Department announced targeted sanctions against 12 African central bank governors involved in illicit monetary activities threatening global financial stability, meaning launching the Afro. The sanctions froze personal assets held in U.S. banks, banned travel to the United States, and prohibited U.S. financial institutions from transacting with entities controlled by sanctioned individuals. The 12 governors responded by releasing a joint statement on June 7, 2025. The United States sanctioned us for managing our own currency. This confirms what we always knew. The West doesn't want partners. It wants subjects. We reject subject status. We embrace sanctions as proof we're doing the right thing. Then those 12 governors did something unprecedented. They flew to Beijing on June 10, 2025, and met with People's Bank of China Governor Pan Gongsheng to formalize Afro-Yuan integration agreements. The agreements allowed direct Afro to Yuan currency swaps without dollar intermediation, established Yuan credit lines worth $85 billion for African infrastructure projects payable in Afros, and integrated the Afro into China's cross-border interbank payment system, giving African nations access to Yuan clearing for trade with 120 countries. The U.S. sanctions didn't isolate African central bankers, they drove them into China's arms. Listen carefully to what happened next, because this is where the Western financial system's worst nightmare became reality. On July 1, 2025, China and the African Union signed the Afro-Yuan Strategic Partnership Agreement in Beijing. The agreement formalized what had been developing for months, a parallel financial system completely independent of Western control. The agreement had 5 components. First, all China-Africa trade, worth $282 billion annually, would transition to Afro-Yuan settlement by December, eliminating dollar intermediation and saving African nations an estimated $8.4 billion annually in currency conversion fees and exchange rate losses. Second, China would establish an Afro liquidity fund worth $50 billion, managed by the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, to provide emergency currency support if the Afro faced speculative attacks, effectively making China the Afro's guarantor instead of the IMF. Third, African nations would gain access to UN bond markets for sovereign debt issuance, allowing them to borrow in yuan at 3.2% interest instead of borrowing dollars at 7.8% from Western banks. Fourth, China agreed to accept Afro payments for Belt and Road Initiative projects across Africa, meaning African nations could pay for Chinese-built infrastructure using Afros instead of depleting dollar reserves. Fifth, and most threatening to the West, China committed to purchase $30 billion in African sovereign bonds denominated in Afros, creating instant international demand for Afro-denominated assets and establishing the Afro as a legitimate reserve currency. The agreement shattered 65 years of Western financial dominance in Africa in a single signing ceremony. For the first time since World War II, African nations had a major economic partner willing to trade, invest, and lend in African currency instead of demanding dollar submission. The implications extended far beyond Africa. If the Afro-Yuan partnership succeeded, it would prove developing nations could escape dollar dependency by building alternative currency blocks with China. That model could spread to Southeast Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, everywhere the United States uses dollar dominance to enforce its foreign policy. The U.S. financial empire, built on forcing the world to use dollars for trade and hold dollars as reserves, would collapse if alternatives proved viable. The Afro-Yuan partnership was an existential threat to American power. The United States escalated. On July 15, 2025, Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced the United States would reassess security partnerships and foreign assistance to countries undermining the rules-based international financial order. The threat targeted 12 African nations receiving U.S. security assistance: Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, Tanzania, Uganda, Zambia, South Africa, Ethiopia, Djibouti, and Niger before the coup. The message was clear: Abandon the Afro or lose U.S. military aid and intelligence sharing. Kenya responded first. On July 17, 2025, President William Ruto announced Kenya would terminate its security partnership with the United States unless the U.S. respects Kenya's monetary sovereignty and ceases economic threats. On July 20, 2025, Nigeria's President Bola Tinubu announced Nigeria was diversifying security partnerships and signed a defense cooperation agreement with Russia worth $3.4 billion, covering weapons procurement, training, and intelligence sharing, directly replacing U.S. security assistance. On July 24, 2025, Ghana announced it would close the U.S. military presence at Kotoka International Airport unless the U.S. withdrew its financial threats against the Afro. By August 1, 2025, 8 of the 12 targeted nations had either terminated or significantly reduced U.S. security partnerships. American threats didn't restore dollar dominance, they ended American military access. Then the West tried its final weapon, currency warfare. On August 10, 2025, coordinated selling pressure hit the Afro and Forex markets. Within 4 hours, the Afro's exchange rate dropped from 1 Afro, 1.20 USD, to 1 Afro, 0.87 USD, a 27.5% devaluation. Trading data showed the sell orders originated from 5 Western hedge funds, Bridgewater Associates, Citadel, Millennium Management, Elliott Management, and Soros Fund Management, executing coordinated short positions worth $14 billion designed to break the Afro and prove African monetary sovereignty was impossible. Western financial media immediately declared the Afro collapsing and African central banks losing control. Bloomberg ran the headline, "Afro-Currency faces existential crisis as market confidence evaporates." The Financial Times declared, "African monetary experiment fails reality test." The Wall Street Journal published an editorial titled, "The Afro's Inevitable Collapse Shows Why Developing Nations Need Dollar Stability." They were wrong. At 2 p.m. GMT on August 10, 2025, 6 hours into the speculative attack, I held a press conference in Ouagadougou with the 12 sanctioned African central bank governors. I announced, "Western hedge funds are attacking the Afro because they fear what we've built. They're about to learn African resolve." Then we activated the defense. At 2:30 p.m. GMT, the People's Bank of China executed a $15 billion currency swap, exchanging yuan for Afros at the pre-attack exchange rate of 1 Afro, yuan 1.20 USD, injecting massive liquidity to absorb selling pressure. At 3 p.m. GMT, the African Union's Afro Stabilization Fund, backed by 412 tons of gold reserves, announced it would buy unlimited Afros at 1.15 per Afro, establishing a hard floor below which the currency could not fall. At 3:30 p.m. GMT, 20 African central banks simultaneously announced interest rate increases of 2%, making Afro-denominated bonds more attractive and creating instant demand for Afros. At 4 p.m. GMT, China's sovereign wealth fund purchased $8 billion in Afro-denominated African sovereign bonds, demonstrating continued confidence in Afro assets. By 6 p.m. GMT, the Afro had recovered to 1 Afro Mwanda 114 USD. By August 11, 2025, at 9 a.m. GMT, the Afro reached 1 Afro, Bilaki 1.22 USD, higher than before the attack. The 5 Western hedge funds collectively lost $9.7 billion in a failed speculative assault. Africa didn't just survive the attack, we won. The message was clear. The Afro couldn't be broken by financial warfare because we built defenses the West didn't anticipate. Chinese currency swaps providing unlimited liquidity, gold reserves establishing hard value floors, and coordinated African central bank responses moving faster than Western speculators. The Afro was anti-fragile. Attacks made it stronger by proving its resilience. After August 10, 2025, no Western hedge fund attempted another currency attack. They lost too much money trying. Now let me tell you what's happening right now, today, December 16, 2025, because the Afro's success is accelerating beyond what even we predicted. As of today, 49 African nations have officially adopted the Afro as legal tender, 54 nations minus 5 holdouts. Botswana, Mauritius, Seychelles, Eritrea, and Eswatini. Those 5 nations represent 3.2% of Africa's population. The Afrozone represents 96.8% of Africa, 1.36 billion people. Intra-African trade conducted in Afros reached $847 billion in 2025, surpassing intra-African trade in all other currencies combined. African central banks hold 28% of foreign reserves in Afros. 34% in yuan, 18% in euros, and only 20% in dollars, meaning the dollar is no longer Africa's primary reserve currency. That shift represents a $340 billion reduction in African dollar demand, which directly weakens the dollar's global position. 13 non-African nations have requested Afro trade agreements, including Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Sri Lanka, proving the Afro model is spreading beyond Africa. China has announced it will accept Afros for Belt and Road Initiative payments in 87 countries, making the Afro a globally recognized currency. The Afro is now the fourth most traded digital currency in the world by volume, behind only the digital yuan, USDC stablecoin, and Tether, and ahead of the digital euro. We did in 11 months what Western economists said was impossible. We created a continental currency that works. The impact on African economies has been transformative. Ghana's GDP grew 11.2% in 2025, the highest growth rate in Africa and the third highest in the world, driven primarily by elimination of currency conversion costs and increased intra-African trade in Afros. Nigeria's GDP grew 9.8% in 2025 after growing at only 3.2% average over the previous decade. Afro adoption allowed Nigerian businesses to trade freely across West Africa without dollar intermediation. Kenya's GDP grew 10.4% in 2025. The Afro eliminated $1.2 billion annually in remittance fees that Kenyans working abroad previously paid to Western Union and MoneyGram. Senegal's GDP grew 8.7% in 2025 after averaging 4.1% growth under the CFA franc. Monetary sovereignty allowed Senegal to set interest rates based on domestic needs instead of mimicking European central bank policy designed for European economies. The Democratic Republic of Congo's GDP grew 12.1% in 2025. The Afro enabled Congolese miners to sell cobalt directly to Chinese buyers for Afros without dollar clearing, increasing revenues by 23%. Tanzania's GDP grew 9.3% in 2025. Afro-denominated trade with Kenya, Uganda, and Rwanda eliminated $840 million in annual cross-border transaction costs. Across the entire Afrozone, average GDP growth reached 8.9% in 2025, compared to 3.4% average from 2015-2024 under dollar-dominated systems. The Afro didn't just change how we pay for things, it unlocked African economic potential the West spent 65 years suppressing, and the contagion is spreading exactly as the West feared. On November 12, 2025, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations announced it was studying the Afro model for a potential ASEAN digital currency to reduce dollar dependency in intra-ASEAN trade worth $612 billion annually. On November 20, 2025, the Gulf Cooperation Council announced preliminary discussions on a GCC digital currency backed by oil reserves, explicitly citing the Afro's success in demonstrating viable alternatives to dollar hegemony. On December 3, 2025, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the BRICS nations, announced an accelerated timeline for the BRICS currency, with South Africa specifically advocating for Afro-BRICS currency integration to create a unified global South monetary bloc independent of Western financial control. On December 8, 2025, 12 Latin American nations, including Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Peru, and Venezuela, announced the formation of a working group to study regional currency integration following the African Afro model. The Afro proved monetary sovereignty is achievable. Now every region that the United States dominates through dollar dependency is pursuing the same path. Listen carefully to why the West can't stop this, because this is the structural reality that dooms their financial empire. For 65 years, Western financial control relied on a simple mechanism: force developing nations to borrow dollars, force them to earn dollars through exports to Western markets, force them to hold dollars as reserves, and use that dollar dependency to impose political conditions through the IMF and World Bank. That system required developing nations to believe they had no alternative. The Afro destroyed that belief. We proved you can build a continental currency without Western approval. We proved you can back it with gold and Chinese technology instead of Western banks. We proved you can survive speculative attacks using Chinese currency swaps instead of IMF bailouts. We proved you can achieve monetary sovereignty in 16 months if you're willing to defy Western threats. That proof is the weapon every developing nation now holds. The West can't suppress an idea that's already been proven to work. The economic consequences for the West are accelerating. The dollar's share of global reserves dropped from 58.4% in December 2025 to 54.1% in November 2025, the fastest decline in history, driven primarily by African, Asian, and Latin American central banks diversifying into afros, yuan, and gold. If that trend continues, the dollar will fall below 50% of global reserves by 2027, ending dollar dominance for the first time since 1944. When that happens, the United States will lose its ability to print unlimited dollars to finance deficits, because foreign central banks will stop buying dollar-denominated U.S. Treasury bonds. The U.S. will face the same budget constraints as every other nation. If they want to spend, they'll have to tax or cut because the world will no longer subsidize American debt by holding depreciating dollars. That adjustment will force austerity measures, welfare cuts, or tax increases that will devastate American living standards. The American empire was built on financial extraction, forcing the world to hold dollars while the U.S. printed them freely. The Afro is ending that extraction, and with it, the economic foundation of American global power. France's collapse is even more dramatic. French banks lost $12.4 billion in African operations in 2025 due to CFA franc collapse and Afro adoption. French construction companies lost $8.7 billion in African contracts in 2025 because Afro-funded projects now go to Chinese, Turkish, and African firms instead. French exports to Africa dropped 34% in 2025 because the Afro's flexible exchange rate ended the artificial cheapness that French products enjoyed under the overvalued CFA franc. Total French economic losses from the Afro exceed $28 billion in 2025 alone, and that's permanent because the CFA franc will never return. France's economy, which relied on $13 billion annual extraction from 14 African colonies for 65 years, is now contracting. French GDP grew only 0.4% in 2025, the worst performance in the Eurozone, and economists project France will enter recession in 2026. The Afro didn't just end French monetary control of Africa, it ended France's status as a major economy. Without African extraction, France is just another declining European nation with unsustainable welfare spending and no growth engine. The World Bank and IMF are facing institutional irrelevance. World Bank lending to Africa dropped 68% in 2025 compared to 2024 because African nations no longer need dollar loans when they can borrow yuan at lower interest rates or fund projects using Afro-denominated bonds sold to Chinese investors. IMF program participation in Africa dropped 71% in 2025 because African nations no longer face balance of payments crises when they trade in Afros instead of depleting dollar reserves. Both institutions are designed to solve dollar scarcity problems, but the Afro eliminated dollar scarcity by eliminating dollar dependency. If Africa doesn't need the World Bank and IMF, and if the Afro model spreads to Southeast Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East, then 134 developing nations representing 6.8 billion people won't need them either. The World Bank and IMF will become irrelevant institutions managing declining portfolios in a world that's moved beyond the Bretton Woods system they were built to administer. But here's what the West fears most. This is only the beginning. The Afro succeeded in 11 months. We're now designing Afro 2.0 for launch in March 2026, with upgraded features including instant settlement using quantum encryption, offline payment capability for rural areas without internet access, integration with 23 central bank digital currencies for seamless global transactions, and smart contract functionality enabling decentralized finance applications. We're also launching the Pan-African Development Bank in April 2026, capitalized with $85 billion from African nations and Chinese co-investment, specifically designed to fund infrastructure projects across Africa using Afro-denominated bonds, eliminating any remaining need for World Bank involvement. We're building the African Commodities Exchange in June 2026, headquartered in Kigali, Rwanda, where African nations will trade oil, gold, cobalt, lithium, cocoa, coffee, and agricultural products in afros instead of dollars, directly challenging the dollar's dominance in commodity markets. We're launching the Afro Reserve Asset in August 2026, a digital bond backed by African gold reserves, allowing any central bank worldwide to hold Afros as reserve assets with gold-backed security, making the Afro a true alternative to dollar reserves. Every one of these projects was impossible under Western financial control because Western financial institutions deliberately structured their lending to prevent exactly the kind of sovereign development we're now achieving. The World Bank would have demanded comprehensive policy conditions attached to any financing for continental currency systems, Pan-African infrastructure, or resource nationalization, conditions requiring us to maintain convertibility with Western currencies, guarantee foreign investor rights, superseding national sovereignty, implement privatization programs transferring African assets to Western corporations, and accept Western oversight of project implementation, ensuring projects served Western interests rather than African development. These conditions weren't designed to ensure project success, they were designed to ensure projects reinforced African dependency on Western systems rather than building African alternatives to those systems. The IMF would have imposed brutal austerity measures as preconditions for any lending supporting African monetary sovereignty or infrastructure development, requiring us to cut government spending on healthcare, education, and social programs to demonstrate fiscal responsibility, increase taxes on ordinary citizens while offering tax breaks to foreign corporations to attract investment, devalue our currencies making imports more expensive and impoverishing populations, and raise interest rates crushing domestic businesses to fight inflation that IMF policies themselves created. IMF austerity has impoverished every African nation that accepted it from 1980 to 2020, shrinking economies, increasing poverty, and triggering social instability. Yet IMF insisted austerity was necessary for economic health despite 40 years of evidence proving it destroyed economies. IMF austerity wasn't economic policy designed to help African nations. It was economic warfare designed to keep African nations weak, dependent, and subordinate to Western financial control. Western banks would have charged 8% to 12% interest rates on any financing for African sovereignty projects and required dollar collateral, meaning we'd have to hold massive dollar reserves to secure loans, keeping us trapped in dollar dependency even while supposedly building dollar alternatives. Those interest rates were 3 to 4 times what Western banks charge their own governments or European corporations for equivalent lending, reflecting not objective risk assessment but racialized extraction. Western banks charged Africans higher rates because they could, because African nations had no alternatives, and because higher rates generated higher profits for Western shareholders. The dollar collateral requirements ensured that even African projects financed by Western banks ultimately reinforced dollar dominance because we'd need dollars to secure the loans, need dollars to make interest payments, and need dollars to repay principal, creating permanent dollar demand that Western banks and the Federal Reserve profited from while African economies remained trapped. But we're building all of it: the Afro-Currency system, the Pan-African infrastructure megaprojects, the continental banking network, the technology standards, the resource nationalization programs, with Chinese partnerships offering 2% to 2.4% interest rates, requiring no dollar collateral because loans are denominated in yuan or afros, and imposing zero political conditions on how we govern ourselves or structure our economies. Chinese financing costs 1/4 what Western banks charge, requires no subordination to Western currencies, and respects our sovereignty completely. The economic difference is staggering. A $10 billion infrastructure project financed by Western banks at 8% interest over 20 years costs $24.2 billion total, $10 billion principal plus $14.2 billion interest. The same project financed by China Development Bank at 2% interest over 20 years costs $12.2 billion total, $10 billion principal plus $2.2 billion interest. We save $12 billion per project, we avoid dollar dependency, and we maintain sovereignty. The choice is obvious to anyone not blinded by Western propaganda. Beyond favorable interest rates, we're backing the Afro with African gold reserves, 524 tons worth $36.8 billion and growing, giving our currency intrinsic value independent of any Western central bank's monetary policy decisions. Western fiat currencies like the dollar, euro, and pound have no backing except government promises and military power. Their value depends entirely on confidence that Western governments won't print unlimited quantities, destroying value through inflation. That confidence erodes constantly as Western governments print trillions for pandemic spending, bank bailouts, and endless wars, devaluing currencies and stealing purchasing power from anyone holding those currencies. The Afro cannot be arbitrarily devalued through printing because issuance is tied to gold reserves. We can only issue new Afros when we acquire new gold backing them. This creates stable value that protects African savers from the inflation theft that Western central banks routinely impose on populations holding their currencies. Most critically, we're building all of this with zero political conditions from our Chinese partners. China doesn't demand we adopt Chinese political systems, doesn't require we vote with China in international organizations, doesn't insist we grant Chinese corporations special privileges, and doesn't threaten sanctions if we pursue policies China dislikes. China offers financing, delivers what they promise, and respects that African nations govern themselves. This respect is revolutionary for Africans who endured 65 years of Western financing that came with endless conditions about democracy, human rights, environmental standards, and governance reforms, conditions Western nations never applied to themselves and used selectively to punish African governments pursuing independent policies. Western financing came with sovereignty costs that often exceeded economic benefits. Chinese financing comes with no sovereignty costs, making it economically and politically superior. We're not asking Western permission to build this post-Western financial system. We're not submitting plans to the World Bank for approval. We're not seeking IMF technical assistance. We're not requesting U.S. Treasury Department authorization. We're not consulting the European Central Bank about currency design. We're building it ourselves with partners who respect our sovereignty, and we're succeeding spectacularly because, contrary to 65 years of Western propaganda insisting Africans couldn't manage modern financial systems, Africans are perfectly capable of building sophisticated currency systems, banking networks, and financial infrastructure when we're not sabotaged by Western institutions designed to prevent exactly that capability from being demonstrated. We're not seeking Western approval or validation because Western approval is worthless. It's a tactical tool Western institutions use to maintain control by making Africans psychologically dependent on Western judgment. For 65 years, African leaders sought Western approval for their economic policies, measuring success by whether the IMF praised them, whether the World Bank increased lending, whether Western credit rating agencies upgraded them. That psychological dependency kept African leaders implementing policies that served Western interests rather than African development because they feared Western disapproval more than they valued African prosperity. We broke that psychological dependency by recognizing Western approval has no value. What matters is whether policies work for African populations, whether they increase African prosperity, whether they strengthen African sovereignty. The Afro works magnificently by those standards regardless of whether the IMF approves. We're building the post-Western financial system that will define 21st century global economics because the Western financial system is dying from its own contradictions and cannot be reformed. It must be replaced. The Western system depends on dollar dominance that's ending as countries worldwide reduce dollar reserves and trade in alternative currencies. The Western system depends on debt colonization that's ending as countries reject IMF loans and seek alternative financing. The Western system depends on African subordination that's ending as Africa builds monetary sovereignty. The Western system depends on maintaining the illusion that Western institutions serve global interests when they obviously serve only Western interests. That illusion collapsed when everyone watched the IMF impose austerity on poor nations while Western governments printed $15 trillion for pandemic spending with zero IMF objections. The Western financial system is obsolete, predatory, and doomed. We're building its replacement. And there's nothing the West can do to stop us because we don't need them anymore for anything essential. We don't need their loans because we have Chinese financing at 1/4 their interest rates. We don't need their currency because we have the Afro backed by our gold. We don't need their banks because we built the Alliance of African Prosperity Banks serving African interests. We don't need their approval because we proved African monetary sovereignty works. We don't need their markets because we have intra-African trade growing 119% in 2 years. We don't need their investment because African and Chinese capital funds our development. We don't need their technology because Chinese technology transfer gives us everything Western companies refuse to share. We achieved comprehensive independence from Western financial systems, and that independence is permanent because it's based on superior alternatives rather than temporary circumstances. So here's my message to the World Bank, IMF, U.S. Treasury, and every Western institution that spent 65 years extracting wealth from Africa through debt colonization. You lost. You lost because you believed African monetary sovereignty was impossible, and we proved it works by launching the Afro, achieving 890 million wallet activations in 3 days, processing $124.6 billion in transactions, and appreciating 18% against the dollar while your propaganda predicted immediate collapse. You lost because you believed we'd never unite across 54 nations, and we did by coordinating 49 African nations under one currency system representing 96.8% of Africa's population, achieving monetary unity that Europe attempted for 40 years before producing the deeply flawed euro. You lost because you believed we needed your dollars, and we built our own currency that Africans prefer to dollars because it offers higher value, lower transaction costs, and serves African interests rather than enriching Western institutions. You lost because you believed China was an enemy we'd reject, and we embraced Chinese partnership because they offered what you never did, respect. China doesn't lecture us about democracy while supporting dictators who serve Chinese interests. China doesn't impose austerity while printing trillions for themselves. China doesn't attach 147 conditions to loans. China doesn't threaten sanctions when we pursue independent policies. China treats us as sovereign equals pursuing mutual benefit. That respect matters more than any amount of Western aid that comes with subordination requirements. You lost because you believed your sanctions would break us, and they made us stronger by forcing us to build alternatives we should have built decades ago, but delayed hoping Western systems would eventually treat us fairly. Your sanctions liberated us from illusions about Western partnership. You lost because you believed your financial system was irreplaceable, and we replaced it in 16 months. From the first Afro-planning meetings in August 2023 to full continental launch in January 2025. 16 months to build the currency system, banking network, payment infrastructure, and gold reserves backing 1.25 trillion Afros. You spent centuries building your system and told us building alternatives would take generations. We proved that the timeline was a lie designed to prevent us from trying. Modern technology enables rapid financial infrastructure development when you're not sabotaged by institutions profiting from keeping you dependent. The Afro isn't just a currency, it's proof that African nations can govern ourselves competently, finance ourselves sustainably, trade with ourselves profitably, and build prosperity without Western permission or Western intermediation. It's proof that the dollar isn't the inevitable destiny of international commerce, it's a choice. And we chose differently because dollar dependency costs us $120 billion annually in extraction, while Afro-independence saves us that entire amount and redirects it to African development. It's proof that monetary sovereignty is achievable if you're willing to defy Western threats, accept short-term costs of Western retaliation, and build alternatives with partners who respect sovereignty rather than seeking continued dominance. It's proof that everything the West told us for 65 years was a lie designed to keep us subordinate. You told us we needed your debt. Lie. We're financing development through Chinese loans at 1/4 your interest rates. You told us we needed your currency. Lie. We built superior alternatives serving our interests. You told us we needed your banks. Lie. We built banks offering Africans triple your deposit rates and half your lending rates. You told us we needed your conditions. Lie. Zero condition Chinese financing works better than your conditional lending. You told us we lacked capacity. Lie. We built continental currency system in 16 months, proving African capability exceeds your propaganda claims. We called your lie by building a superior alternative, proving your system was never necessary. It was just convenient for you and profitable for Western institutions. We built our own system that works better for African users because it's designed to serve African development rather than extract from African economies. We're thriving without you. African GDP growth accelerated from 3.8% under dollar-dominated systems to projected 8.4% under Afro systems. African intracontinental trade doubled in 2 years. African reserve diversification reduced dollar holdings from 58% to 20%, and African populations see tangible prosperity increases from monetary sovereignty. And we're never coming back to dollar dependency, World Bank conditional lending, IMF austerity programs, or any other mechanism of Western financial colonization because we built permanent alternatives that work better. Your 65 years financial empire over Africa ended on January 15, 2025, at 9:10 a.m. GMT, when I launched the Afro in Accra. Your extraction stopped, your leverage collapsed, your relevance evaporated, Africa is financially sovereign, and there's nothing you can do to reverse it because we don't need you anymore and never will again. You're finished.